Welcome to another episode where I get to speak to incredible people from around the world. I love to attract the very best of leaders, people who are genuinely can see are practicing human-centered leadership wherever I go. My next guest, I'm particularly excited because he's a police officer. He's a chief superintendent with the College of Policing. And I've been watching Dave for a while now, and I resonate so strongly with everything that he says. It's a breath of fresh air. So David, welcome onto the show. It's honestly, we've been trying to plan this for a while now. It's great to finally get you here.
And it's good to be here. And I'm really looking forward to the chat. Thank you.
Like with all our guests, I always end up having 5-minute conversations just before we start, get to know each other. But we've ended up having like a 40-minute conversation, Dave. It's been great just catching up on what's happening in policing. But one of the big things happening in policing this week, only a few days ago, we had the Casey review, Baroness Casey review into the Metropolitan Police, which talks about, misogyny, racism, essentially the culture of the Metropolitan Police. But I think it goes beyond the Metropolitan. This has got to be symbolic of the whole of the police service across England and Wales, and probably even Scotland, I guess.
Yeah, and it's been a really tough week to be a police officer, regardless of where you are. The Casey report focuses on the Met, but you are right in saying that these issues transcend, I think, one police organisation in the UK, and I think we'd be very naive to think that that is the case. So I have been personally disappointed when I have looked through the report. The vast majority of police officers will feel the same way. They'll be disappointed, they'll be upset. And I think what it's done, once again, to policing is it's held a mirror up to the service. And none of us particularly like what we see. And rather than this simply being another damning report into policing, and unfortunately over the 30 years service I've had, there have been a number, we really need to use this as a catalyst for change.
Like you, I've been involved in policing in one way or another for nearly 4 decades now, and I've seen many of these reports, right from the Scarman report in the early 80s through to McPherson and Stephen Lawrence, through to this one. But actually, there's not much different being said in this report than there has been in other reports. The one thing that I think is important to stress here is the individuals and the behaviors is not an endemic thing. This is not, it's not a rampant virus throughout the entire police service, because the vast majority of the people that I have worked with in my time in policing have been some of the most dedicated, motivated and compassionate individuals that you can care to meet. But of course, in any organization, like with any organization, we get those individuals who are not just bad apples. I think it softens it when we say bad apples. They're incredibly bad individuals who are in the wrong organization with an incredible amount of power. And that's what we've seen over the last several months with some of the cases in the Met, haven't we? So I think there's 2 issues for me here. And again, this transcends beyond policing for me. This can be going on in any single organization. There are 2 issues for me. One is about rooting out these bad apples who are, by any other definition, committing gross misconduct or criminality even. And the other issue is around the culture that allows some of those individuals to hide or to evolve. What do you think the key issues are here that allow these individuals to fester in organizations?
I think both issues that you mentioned there, which are obviously very closely related, come down to one thing, and that is leadership. Culture is driven by leadership. Yeah. And policing talks about the importance of leadership and values-based leadership. And all these things are very easy to say and describe and articulate across a wider organisation, because I've seen it many times in my career where we talk about here are our organisational values. here are the values that we expect our officers and staff and our leaders to display. But sadly, what policing proves, not just policing, quite sure other sectors and organisations are in a similar position, is that there is a disconnect, clearly, between what we talk about in terms of values, personal leadership values, and what we actually go forward and convey and deliver as leaders within policing. Because it's quite apparent that these issues, and there are some absolutely horrid, devastating findings in Casey's report, these issues do not happen overnight. They take a long time to embed in an organisation, and to me, that is a symptom of, at best, inconsistent standards of leadership, at worst, poor leadership.
One of the things that you've touched upon there is values. And I know in my time how many times we have talked about organizational values. I recollect where, we used to have what we call the annual planning seminar in my old force, where we disappeared for 2 days. Anybody from inspector level upwards, right up to the chief officer level, we all went away and we thrashed out what the important values and strategic priorities were for our organization over the next year. And so I think a lot of thought went into the values, but holding people to account against those values, I think that's where we missed a trick. So often we would hold people to account against some competency framework, as you remember, we make it really mechanistic and process driven, but actually holding people to account against values might be really, really powerful. What do you think on that?
For me, that is the absolute necessary step. I don't think there is any point in having values that the organisation have developed in consultation more often than not with its internal workforce, and if they're going to do it right, should be doing it with external stakeholders and communities. But what absolutely needs to happen there is a mechanism of socialising those with the organisation, and I think that we have got better at that. But we also need to tie those values into our sort of day-to-day and the behaviours that we expect of our police officers and police staff, sticking with the police profession here. And what I mean by that is that if people are planning to progress in the organisation, if they want promotion, if they want lateral development, they're going to have to signpost and prove to the organisation and the leadership within the organisation and demonstrate in evidence that they understand the values, and more, that they can convey a sense that they have actually demonstrated those values. Because particularly in leadership roles, and when I talk about leadership in policing, I'm talking about frontline supervision, sergeants, inspectors. If it's not happening at that level, then something's going to go wrong. And from all the negative examples, including the Casey review, we hear time after time that there's a failure of leadership at those frontline supervision levels. And for me, if you're talking about demonstrating value, organisational values and personal leadership values, and yes, the two are very similar, we have to be holding our leadership to account.
So what you're saying really is that values should really be sitting at the heart of any organisation, whether it's a police service or elsewhere. The values should sit at the very, very heart. And actually we should measure our leaders' capability, not just against some kind of a competency framework, but against the values. And I mean, I'm sure you'll agree, but the higher up you get into any leadership role, the more the values become important, because we want to make sure that we've got value-driven individuals leading the organization much more strategically, it becomes less about technical skills. And I know that, in policing, we have gold commanders and silver commanders, and there is some technicality involved in there, some training. I was one, I'm sure you are as well. Huge responsibility comes with that. But actually on a day-to-day basis, we're managing people, we're influencing people, and therefore we need to get really, really good at understanding people and living those values out that the organization is all about.
Yeah, and you say living out the values, and again, if senior leaders are not living those values every day, and indeed being able to reflect, and using that same analogy of the mirror, holding the mirror up to ourselves as senior leaders within the organisation, and questioning whether we are actually demonstrating those values. Do we understand how important they are, and do we understand how we need to be demonstrating those? Because when you take on a senior leadership role, which is a big privilege, I think, in any organisation, people will look to you more than you probably think around how you demonstrate your values, your behaviour, your empathy, your compassion. They will look to you for that. And if they do not see that in the senior leaders of an organisation, I think that then filters down, potentially. So I think the values of senior leaders and being very, very clear about what those are and living them out is so important.
Yeah, I think that's so fundamental. And one of the things I used to say to any department that I took over, I'd bring the senior team together, and I used to talk about the language that comes out of your mouth. For us at that level, it might just be human language, human conversation. But if we don't choose our words correctly, that language, to anybody who might hear it, who is a part of our department and part of our team, it might resonate with them very, very badly or very well. And whichever way it goes, they are going to take that away with them. They will infect other people around them, their loved ones, their friends, their families, their other colleagues. And that is part and parcel of the leadership shadow that we cast in any organization. So all the more reason why we have to live these values out. If that's what we've said the organization is all about, then the more the senior, the leader you become, the more you have to live these values out, and people need to see that you are walking your talk, essentially.
And you remember those. Well, I speak from a sort of personal perspective here, but you remember often the negative leadership experiences,
of course,
as much, if not more, than the positive influences around leadership. And in my sort of leadership journey, I have definitely used those negative leadership experiences I have witnessed and been subject to inform how, as a leader, I will behave in terms of acknowledging that negative impact that even simple things like use of language can have on others, and it definitely resonates when you have been subject to a poor leader. The impact and damage that can cause is huge, and I don't think people set about to be bad leaders. And I really genuinely don't think that we have people out there who are determined to be autocratic, micromanagers, overbearing. I think that there are many reasons why it happens. I think most leaders want to do a good job. Some just get lost along the way.
I think most leaders want to do a good job, but I also live with the belief that most people actually want to be decent people, want to do a good job when they go to work. But in order for them to do that, I think they want to feel valued, appreciated, heard, seen. They want to feel that they've got a level of professional judgment, that they're trusted to do the job.
Yes.
And they want to believe in your organization. They want to trust their leaders. But if we get it wrong as an organization and we break that chain of trust, that therein lies the very start of what can be a really, really detrimental, toxic process that we very often embark upon, that leads to the kind of cultures that we often hear about that are creating all sorts of problems.
I think trust is huge. in any leadership relationship, again, how you reflect on your own experiences here, it can be so damaging and so dysfunctional, actually, if you don't have that trust-based relationship as a leader with the people that you are charged to lead. And it cuts across so many different areas, because if you can't demonstrate that trust, then perverse behaviours kick in. So there's a tendency for people to be over-reliant on the leader. There's a tendency for micromanagement processes to kick in, and they are very destructive. And there's definitely a tendency of people who have a leader demonstrating those traits of micromanagement, lack of trust, lack of empowerment, to lose a bit of themselves in the whole process, and they lose confidence. They lose this appetite that they previously had to go out and do a good job. And if you start doing that, particularly within a profession as impactive as policing, then again you create a team, a workforce that are not going to be delivering as effectively as they can for the public. And that's what I always try and bring it back to. When I talk about leadership within policing, I always align it back to the public service. We can't get caught up in the internal. The internal things are important, and we need to get them right. But we also need to do that with a clear eye on the public and public service. And that's, to me, what it all comes back to.
And there is something in what you've said there, Dave, that just reminded me of another conversation I had only this morning, talking to somebody who is heavily involved in DE&I globally. You talked about the impact that we have on people, and how some of these processes and the lack of, or the micromanagement, how that makes an individual feel. It's this. Sometimes it's about the human feelings that we don't factor in at all. And we were talking in the context of, people from within minoritized communities, and how it is very, very difficult as someone who has been through either overt or covert discrimination, whether it's absolutely extreme bias or whether it's a microaggression, but the feeling that it leaves that individual with, how hard it is to explain that to somebody who is not from that minoritized group. And we both came to the conclusion that the vast majority of leaders, as you quite rightly say, want to be good leaders. But no matter how good they are as human beings, they will never truly be able to empathize with something that they just can't relate to. And it's actually very difficult for somebody from a minoritized community to even explain that. What is this pain that I'm going through? What's this emotion, this feeling? And I talked about some of my examples with yourself, and how it's every single promotion that I ever achieved, there was an element of me thinking that other people are thinking that I only got that because I was brown. No matter how hard I'd worked for that promotion, no matter the fact that I came top, second, or whatever it might have been, there was always something. And, we often talk about imposter syndrome nowadays. It was more than imposter syndrome. It was almost a guilt complex that I'd achieved this level because I was a brown person. So these feelings are very, very hard to explain, very hard. And we only talked about it because you gave me an example of where you'd had a conversation. And I'm so pleased you did, because I've never actually talked about that to anybody. It was quite a cathartic moment for me when I explained my thoughts and how I felt after. When I should have been celebrating an achievement, I actually felt that who is going to be the first person to say to me, "You got that because you're brown?" Because I've had like some of my best friends saying that to me. So this is the sort of dichotomy that we live within, where we can't truly explain it, others can't truly understand it, but we all know that we need to do something about it. So, in policing, we often talk about the recruitment, retention, and progression element. And often progression is something that we don't even think about, because we're so focused on recruitment more often not, that even the retention we don't focus in on. So, in my time in policing, and now I've worked with so many other organizations, they tend always to think about, let's get as many minoritized communities into our organization because we want to be represented. But then what they don't realize is representation actually means that it needs to be there throughout the entirety of the organization. But because they haven't done any work around the retention element and the progression element, you tend to have, a bit like in the NHS, you tend to have most of your diverse workforce at the very front end of your organization. And it peters out very, very quickly up to the senior levels. I'm encouraged by something that you'd said that the police service is doing right now. Well, actually, it's not just the police, it's specifically the Superintendents Association, an association that I was very proud to have been a member of and always saw as being a very forward-thinking organisation. But you're doing some work there, aren't you, to increase the number of minoritised, underrepresented staff coming into the superintending ranks. Do you want to just talk about what you're doing there?
There's a lot to unpack in what you've just said.
I've just gone off on one, haven't I?
No, but
this is your fault, by the way, David. You had that long conversation with me to start me off.
Well, we talked earlier, didn't we? But before I talk about the Superintendents Association scheme that I'm involved in, something you said about leaders who want to try and do the best, and I think that is right. They can't always understand what it's like from underrepresented groups to develop, progress within the service. My challenge to that would be, well, we need to make it our business to understand and do better and make some change in that respect. So I think that comes back to a bit of personal ownership and accountability, that if we understand that issue, then we need to do our best to, as much as we can, to understand, because you're not going to make changes unless you really take a step back, take the time to listen and understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to set the scene a little
Absolutely.
bit. So in that regard, the Superintendents Association, which you were a member of and I am a member of, launched a programme probably about 2 years ago now, termed the Future Supers Programme. And what that aims to do is provide coaching support from existing superintendents and chief superintendents to those from underrepresented groups within the service who are aspiring to get into the superintending ranks. And when I saw the advert come out from the association seeking volunteer coaches, then to me it was a bit of an obvious thing to volunteer for. It was a bit of a no-brainer. But this is something I really want to do. My motivations for doing it were really at the start was I've always been interested in coaching and mentoring and helping people develop in their career, and I thought, well, here's a good opportunity to try and make a bit of a difference and give a little bit back. That's the aspiration. What I have found in the people that I'm working with and I coach is that through those coaching conversations and relationships, I have personally learned an awful lot. So the benefit for me as a leader in the police service has been to understand firsthand some of those barriers, some of those challenges that officers from underrepresented and minoritized groups encounter. And what strongly resonated with me was in my first coaching session with an officer who was about to embark on a promotion process. She said to me, and I actually still get, and we spoke about this earlier, I actually still get a little bit emotional talking about it. And what the officer said was, well, of course, I'm working really hard to get through the process, but I know if I get through the process, it won't be long before someone says, oh, well, of course you got through because you're black. And that absolutely floored me in terms of hearing that firsthand from someone who's striving to go through and working really hard to go through a promotion process, what should be an awesome achievement if you get through it, but actually the thought process was that. And I was really saddened by that, and what it told me is that there's an awful lot more we need to do. So when you see the Casey report coming out, I was astonished to see some of the findings, quite frankly, even although I think we were all bracing for impact and reflecting back to, Stephen Lawrence and McPherson and some of the other things that have come out in between times. I thought, how far have we actually come? And it was quite a sobering moment.
And here's the other thing, Dave, that there is also a massive impact on those from not minoritized communities, from the majority, if you like, other members of the police service who have just, it's almost like a tidal wave, a tsunami across them. And, we're already in policing going through some really difficult times with attrition, the pay and conditions argument, the increased workloads that officers are having to experience right now. We've had research done by the Police Federation that is talking about 1 in 5 police officers are looking at leaving the police service in the next 2 years. And I get approached a lot by police officers either leaving or have left to help them transition into the big wide world. The Casey report seems to be yet another thing that's going to hit them and impact upon them. And is this going to be something that's going to increase attrition potentially in the police service? Are we going to have a more difficult time recruiting quality people into the police service? So there's a huge sort of causal impact, line of impact that can go from this one document across the whole of the police service. And I have to stress again that if it's about the police service, it's also about society, because this is not just limited to the police service. So what is it that we need to do across all organizations? What is a challenge for leaders right now?
Well, you're right. I mean, although the Casey report is specifically about policing and actually specifically about the Met as an organization, going back to the sort of Pelian principles of the police of the public and the public of the police, you have to say that is, sadly, yes, there will be elements of it which are peculiar to police or organisational culture, but you also have to say that has to be somewhat reflective of society in a much wider sense. So I would agree with that point. What worries me and keeps me awake at night is that this tsunami of negativity that has hit the police service, particularly I think over the last 2-3 years, without a doubt has an impact on well-being, on morale, on, yes, attracting, quality recruits into the service, and on retention. And all those factors are definitely not helped by the publication of the Casey report and the media reporting that goes alongside it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and be critical of the media. The media have a job to do. But as a serving police officer, it feels kind of relentless. And that's difficult. That is difficult for serving members of the police family. As to what we do about it, I think we simultaneously need to do 2 things. We need to show that we are absolutely serious about reflecting on the report, that the service are going to make those improvements and changes and be ruthless about rooting out the bad people and getting rid of them. And it needs to have that absolute commitment and stamina to do that. What we've seen in previous years, and I referenced McPherson, but there have been others, is that we have a flurry of activity. It's all pretty frenetic, and lots of things get done, and new departments get set up. But what we don't seem to have, in my view, is the organisational stamina to keep going.
I think there's two things for me. One is, you're absolutely right. I think one is the stamina. And, we only have to look at George Floyd only a few years ago, where there was this incredible flurry of activity, not just in the police service, because I now I'm in a privileged position to work with a lot of organizations, and I've seen this happening in so many, where there's this incredible flurry of activity. I got engaged with so many organizations because they wanted me in to do some work around DE&I. And then it just sort of peters out. And there's two reasons for me. One is this organizational stamina, because it takes work. It takes hard work. And of course, it's going to take hard work if you're going to drive about an environmental change in your organization. But the second thing is, it's about leadership courage. And when I say leadership courage, it is about recognizing, for any leader, like with most chief officers of any organization, will be on some sort of a level of a contract, 4 or 5 years, etc. They have to look beyond the 4 or 5 years that they're going to be there. They need to be thinking about legacy and the organization that they're going to create going forward. When they leave, what kind of an organization will it be? I think that's sort of the crux of the matter for me. How many leaders are thinking beyond that? And actually, this goes right back into the government as well. How many times is the government actually thinking about going beyond the 4 or 5 years that they might be in power? And that for me is the stamina and the leadership courage that you're talking about.
That's a really good point about legacy and about the impact, particularly senior and especially chief officers need to be thinking about. So I think the second bit, other than the criticality of having had the mirror held up to us again and seeing what's on the other side, to react to the challenges posed by Casey and do it swiftly and have that endurance and stamina. I think the second thing is to have the leadership qualities at all level, but particularly as you reference the senior and chief officer ranks, to endure and keep those mechanisms moving forward, rather than have those stick and plaster approach that we've seen in others, as a result of other reviews and reports. And I think senior leaders and chief officers in particular are in that privileged position where they actually can use their role and influence to do that and set that culture and have that organisational and personal commitment. But all the while we're doing that, we need to be looking after the vast majority of good people in the organisation who come to work every day to do a good job. We need to be rewarding and recognising. We need to recognise the impact that all this has on people who just want to come to work, do a good job, look after people, show that empathy, compassion, deal with those that need to be dealt with in terms of criminality. And policing is a complex business now. I mean, 30 years when I joined the police, it was definitely the crime fighting mission. You'd have been the same. It was all about lock up the bad people, look after the good people, do it in a very much a silo without working with anyone else. Partnerships weren't a big thing then. Police officers now, my goodness, they are expected to be so skilled in so many different areas, and fighting crime is only one of those. But we want our police officers to be compassionate, empathetic, and kind in their approach to victims, vulnerable people, witnesses. And therefore, I think we really need to be cognizant of how tough a time this is for policing. Whilst acknowledging the issues and the problems and challenges, we do need to have an eye on officer well-being and making sure that officers feel supported. And that is the job of leaders and politicians and everyone else involved in policing, PCCs, to make sure that we've got that message loud and clear to the vast majority. A
collective responsibility of all of those involved in the leadership of policing. There are two big issues here. One is about creating that inclusive environment where everyone does feel psychologically safe, valued, appreciated, heard and seen. But we need to extend that also to the vast majority of unspoken of, people that we don't even mention, the 130,000 cops, or wherever the number is nowadays, that are out there in, policing the streets of the United Kingdom, we need to understand that the vast majority of them are really good, decent people who are seeing this as a vocation, and they are committed to keeping our streets safe. And we need to think about the impact that these few people are having on all of these greater number of people. David, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and if I can support you in your work in any way, then you only have to shout out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.